Hello and welcome to Module 8, the Rights-Based Ethics. Our discussion will cover these topics: the story of human rights, the Commission on Human Rights, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Our objectives are to identify the conditions that lead to our current understanding of human rights, identify the basic categories of human rights according to the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. 3. Recognize the state of human rights in everyday life within the Philippine context. Number 4. Argue as to whether human rights are innate or not. And number 5. Reconcile morality based on human rights with the other ethical frameworks presented in previous discussions. In this module, we will look at the historical background of human rights. We will talk about some concepts relating to it and its role in shaping our ethical decisions. We have been talking about, we have heard of the phrases, we have to fight for our rights, you don't have a right to do that, that is my right. But what do we exactly know about right? What do we mean by it? So to better understand our conception of human rights, it would be useful to look back on the historical origin of human rights, as well as a document that currently represents it. So what documents am I talking about here? I'm talking of the Philippine Constitution and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You see, before the modern society, one's rights are limited to their community, from the family, the barangay, or the town. So whatever rights you have within that community, that is just your right. It has not expanded the beyond the borders of that community. However, as society expanded and the more that we interacted with one another, the rights have been recognized slowly internationally. And one of the biggest issues, or one of the biggest uh, result of this kind of interaction, was the freedom given to the slaves. So ordinary people were also given a chance to own a property and a chance to elevate themselves from their economic position. And the slaves can free themselves, they can buy their freedom. And let us look at some of the important advances when it comes to the development of our rights. So it's starting, they would say that it started during the time of Cyrus, when he declared some rights given to the people that he colonized. But the written, another important advancement would be in 1215, the Magna Carta, which was given to the people by the king. And this is a very, very big thing because the kings, they own the subjects. They are literally the state. But here, the king gave rights to the people through the Magna Carta. And then in 1628, there is the Petition of Right, which set out the rights of the people. They itemized the rights of the people. And then in 1776, we have the United States Declaration of Independence. And in that proclamation, in that Declaration of Independence, they proclaimed the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And nobody would ever recognize that the pursuit of happiness is crucial and that it can be a right that you can claim. And then in 1789, we have the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a document of France this time stating that all citizens are equal under the law. Now that is a very, very crucial thing because even if there is a disparity, even if there are differences among human beings, but in the eyes of the law, everybody is equal. That's the implication of that. And in 1948, the one that we are now looking to when it comes to the human rights, we have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is the first document listing the 30 rights to which everyone is entitled. Okay, so this is a video by Benedetta Berti. What are the universal human rights? I hope that you watch it on your own. I'm not going to play it now, but we have a very, very informative video coming from YouTube here also. Um, I have shared the link with you as well. Okay, here are some concepts or some principles that I would like you to remember. That rights are claims against others. And that is why if we are claiming some things against others, then we say that we also have a duty. Now, rights and duties always go together. So if for every right that you have, there is a corresponding duty. And now let us look at some of the classifications of rights. The first categories that we have, natural and conventional. Conventional rights are those created by humans. They are generally within the context of social and political organizations. So every time that if you live within a society, and in that society, there are political organizations like the government, for example, then that's when we have the conventional rights. It's a conscious declaration of certain rights that people have to follow and have to respect within that community. One such example is the international human rights. I mentioned earlier that rights are just within the community. But as we progressed and we expanded our borders, we realized that we have a shared experiences with other human beings and that these shared experiences can be translated into rights. And that's why the International Human Rights was born. Another thing is the natural rights. Natural rights pertain to us by virtue of our humanity. Now, if for as long as you are a human being, then you have naturally a right. So they apply to all persons. Natural rights are also commonly called moral rights. So we say that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and right. So it doesn't matter what your status is in life, for as long as you are a human being, then you should already have that right and must be recognized by others also. Another classification of rights would be that between negative and positive right. Let me start first with the negative rights. Negative rights impose duties of non-interference on others. Thus, my right to life as a negative right is a right not to be killed, now for as long as there is no rational reason for me to be killed, because I have the right to breathe, I have the right to continue with my life. And with the positive rights impose duties of assistance on others. So an example of this would be welfare rights impose on the state the duty to assist those who cannot provide for themselves. So the welfare rights state that those who have more should give to those who have less in order for at least the opportunity to be, if not equal, at least not to be so, the gap would not be so wide. And uh, we also have to understand, or I want you to take note also of this one. Ought implies can. What does this mean? People cannot have an obligation to do something that it is impossible for them to do. You cannot ask somebody to give you something that it will be almost impossible. Now the person cannot do that. So the only way that which you can oblige a person, now you can give the person the duty to do that is if the person can actually do that. So what does it mean? An obligation on me, example, okay, an obligation on me to do X asserts that I must choose X among the possibilities that I have. If it is not possible for me to choose X, then I cannot be obligated to choose it. So let me give you an example of this. Okay. Here, example would be if I am in the middle of a desert, so I can have a positive right to food. Okay, I have what again is the positive right? The right of the duty of others to give me food if I am hungry. However, in this case, I cannot impose or I cannot demand my positive right if uh, for example, I am in the middle of a desert. I have run out of food with the other members of an expedition which has crashed. Ayan, kunwari, nandyan, bigla kaming nagkaroon ng airplane crash, and so we are in the desert and there is no way by which we can obtain food. Then none of us has a right to food as a claim against the others. So I cannot exercise that positive right because they cannot give me that. They cannot grant me that right. And another example would be this one. You know, I only have rights against individuals who can exercise freedom and rationality. So this goes to a lot of human beings. I might have a negative natural right to live with reference to other people swimming in the ocean. They cannot kill me. No, because they are the supposition is that they are free to do that and that they are rational enough to know that they should not kill me. However, that kind of right cannot be imposed on somebody who is not rational enough. And that is why I do not have the right to live with reference to the shark who is chasing me. I cannot turn to the shark and say, okay, you know what, you cannot eat me because I have the right to live. Because the the shark just cannot do that because that will go against the maybe the nature of the shark, and it's not rational enough in the sense that we human beings are rational. Because I don't know, maybe they are rational in their own world. Okay, now we have been talking about we talked about natural rights also. But natural rights or natural means we didn't have anything to do with it because it's part of nature. Thus, nobody has exclusive right to it. It's available for everybody and hence regarded as universal. That is, they are supposed to apply to all humans and for many moral theories only to humans. But what is it about humans that provide the basis for such rights? We look at three such bases. They say that only human beings have the right or are capable of having these rights because number one, we have them as endowed by our creator. Now somebody created them to have such rights, and that is why naturally they should have the rights. Number two, we have them based upon actual characteristics of humans. Now that we are special creatures that should have those kinds of rights. And number three, we have them on the basis of our potentialities and capacities. So we are counting on having those rights because of such potentials and our capabilities. An example of that would be the rationality. Now we all have babies have the potential to be rational, and then the adults are capable of being rational, and that is why we have the natural rights as opposed to other species. Now let us look at a document that goes through the core of human rights, at least internationally speaking. We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You have to understand also that when we talk about rights, they are born out of our experiences, out of human experiences. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a response, a direct response to the tragedy of World War II. The genocide, torture, and mass destruction during war are only some of these conditions. And in order to avoid all this from happening again, The states came together and decided to make a list of the human rights that should never ever be violated during peacetime or even during wartime. So it then helps us to view human rights as a continuously evolving concept. Whatever it is that we would consider as a right now might be different when we in the future. Now, if you will look at the history that we've had, certain rights, certain practices that were considered as okay during that time are not okay now because we have recognized that when we think about it, it's not actually in keeping with the right of an individual. And that is why we keep expanding our definition of right. It's evolving, it's changing. With each evolution stemming from the conditions experienced by humanity, we respond to whatever it is that is happening. And as the UDHR was affirmed, it became the basis for bills of rights across different countries. Governments around the world agreed not to pass any laws or ordinances that would go against these principles. We have some specific provisions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, if we can look at the preamble also here, in this preamble, it talks about the equality of people, recognizing that for as long as we are human beings, everybody, these provisions will be applicable to us. So just some of the articles that we have here in Article 1, a declaration that everyone is born free and equal in dignity and with rights. Okay, so here, everyone is born free and equal. And then Article 2, you should never be discriminated against for any reason. So this one is very broad. No discrimination for any reason. Tindi, ano, grabe ito. Kahit anong dahilan, hindi ka dapat pwede ma-discriminate. So we're talking here of your body size, the color, your intellect, and the status in life. And then Article 3, everyone has the rights to life, liberty, and security. That is also part of our Constitution. Article 4, no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. You might be surprised, but there are people who are still enslaved. So there are modern ways of enslaving people. Now we can talk about labor without making them work, without paying them. And then Article 5, no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel or degrading treatment. We also have that in our Constitution. Article 6, you have the right to be treated as a person in the eyes of the law. So walang pagtatrato na para kang hayop. Article 7, you have the right to equality before the law. Now, all these rights, the right to remedy by competent tribunal, ibig sabihin, dapat you should always have the access to courts. No one shall be subject to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile. You cannot be arrested without a warrant of arrest. That is what we're talking here. Article 10, you have the right to a fair and public hearing. So there should be no extrajudicial killing. You should always have the right to be heard. You should always have the right to explain yourself. Article 11, you have the right to be considered innocent until proven guilty. The society might judge us immediately, but at least in the law, you should still be innocent until you are proven guilty. So who has the burden to prove that you are guilty? Then it should be the one who is accusing. So pag nag-accuse ka, of somebody committing a crime, then you should have a proof. It should not be the one to prove that he or she is innocent. Okay? And then Article 12, no one has the right to interfere with your privacy, family, or home, so no trespassing. Nobody should look into your inbox, your emails, and your phones. Article 13, you have the right to freedom of movement in and out of the country. Now, take note that even though they are rights given to individuals or at least written, kasi sabi nga nila, for others, they are natural. So, they were just solidified in the law. Note also that all these rights are not unlimited. They are limited. What's the limitation? You also have to balance it with the right of the state. and also the right of another individual. So even if you say that you say, for example, in Article 13, you have the right to freedom of movement. However, what if you made a crime against the state? And you are supposed to go to jail. You cannot use that because we have to balance that with the right of the state to have order in that society. And also, you cannot also just barge into another person's house, you know, just because you have the freedom of movement. Because under Article 12, remember that they also have the right to privacy. So your right ends when the other person's right begins. Now, Article 14, you have the right to seek asylum in other countries from persecution, especially if there is really a very strong commission of abuse on your rights. Article 15, you have the right to a nationality, and it's so difficult for people not to have a nationality, not to have an actual state to live in. It feels like you're a homeless person. Article 16, you have the right to marriage and to raise a family if you want to. But it doesn't mean that it's mandatory. Right mo lang yan. Article 17, you have the right to own property. Article 18, you have the right to freedom of belief and religion. Now, please take note here that in the case of freedom of belief and religion, the practice of religion is also limited. But the freedom to believe anything that you want to worship any form that you want to, that is unlimited. Article 19, you have the right to freedom of opinion and expression. No matter how intelligent your opinion is, no matter how stupid one's opinion is, you still have the right to that. Article 20, you have the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, to form an organization, mag-rally for as long as it is peaceful. Article 21, you have the right to take part in the government of your country. You should vote if you are given the privilege to vote. And malapit na. I hope that a lot of you have already registered. Article 22, you have the right to social security. Article 23, you have the right to desirable work and to join trade unions. Now, another thing that I want to emphasize here is that even though we have the same rights, everybody across the border, the interpretation of these rights within that community might change. Okay, so just like for example, Article 23, what do we mean by desirable work? Na at least something that will not make you be treated as an animal. At least yun ang basic dito. Article 24, we have the right to rest and leisure. Kanya-kanya pa rin tayong interpretation of what would be the rest and leisure for us. Article 25, we have the right to an adequate standard of living. So the same thing also with this one. What would be the Philippine standard of adequate standard of living as opposed to the American standard of living? So I am sure there would be a wide gap um, between the two. Article 26, you have the right to education. Article 27, you have the right to participate in the cultural life of community. Okay, so that is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Another thing, Article 28, here you have the right uh, you have the right to a social order, and then we all have a responsibility to the people around us and should protect their rights and freedoms. So Article 29 is an example of a positive right, our duty towards others. Article 30, you have the right to freedom from state of persons interference in these rights. Oh no, hindi tayo pakikialaman when we are practicing this for as long as it is within the legal exercise of those rights. So that's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You can see these rights are also found in the Philippine Constitution. Now, the UTHR have been shaped by the specific experiences from the different parts of the world. Yet, they are in a way shared experiences, and thus the specific provisions of UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, share the same basic principle. And what is that basic principle? that all human beings everywhere, all the time, possess these rights. So lahat tayo for as long as you are a human being. Now, the question, it gave rise now to the debate between whether human rights are innate, are they natural, or whether they are merely social constructs developed by men, or are they conventional. So on the side of the innate, the United States Declaration of Independence famously claims that rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are endowed to humans by a creator, and thus cannot be taken away nor surrendered for any reason. And we follow that in our preamble in the Philippine Constitution. You say, we, the sovereign Filipino people, imploring the aid of the Almighty God, we are saying that everybody has that. And then, conventional. On the side of the social construct, many critics would be quick to point out that although the language of the U.S. Declaration speaks to its universality, the social practice of the U.S. at the time speak about how rights are limited by existing social structures of the time. So even though we say, okay, you might have the right, but it will never have been recognized without the society. So it was actually created by that society. That is what they are talking here. Now, whereas for the role of the society and politics, despite the two seemingly opposed arguments, it cannot be denied that the dynamic nature of society and politics influence the changes in how we understand human rights and how we implement rules and regulations because of it. The Declaration of our Human Rights is a response, as we said earlier, to the changing times. And that is why rights that we are fighting for now were not really thought of before. An example of that would be the rights of the LGBTQ plus community. And then we also have some people fighting for animal rights. So it's not anymore just limited to the humans having rights. And then we also have the speciesism. They are saying that why would human beings as species be more special than the others? Why would animals be more special than the others? Why can't all species be equal? And then another right just recently by the Supreme Court, the Philippine Supreme Court recognized that uh, women or their children should not automatically follow the surname of the father. They can opt whose surname they would like to follow. So they can choose the mother or they can choose the father. Okay? And then we also have to look at the changing environment. The human rights in the changing times, we have for every changes in the environment that we have, there should also be a shift in how we exercise those rights. No, hanggang saan yung comfort natin that will sacrifice our environment? Or should we limit those rights in order for us to save our environment? So despite the multitude safeguards on the protection of human rights and the signed commitment of different countries in respecting these, multiple cases of human rights violations are still reported today. You see, the UDHR have been signed by a lot of the countries and they have promised to follow those that were written in that declaration. However, in practice, it still has a long way to go. Understanding how human rights violations exist would be a step to further understand why it is important to promote human rights as basis for morality. Now, one thing that makes rights-based ethics very good, or that it should be imposed or should be followed, is the practicality. Why would it be practical? Because it is backed up by the teeth of the law. So the rights, because they are now recognized as legal rights, if they are recognized as legal rights, that means that violations of these legal rights will now create a sanction, a penalty against those people who are violating or abusing one's rights. So how is that translated in the Philippine context? We have certain rights that parallel the UDHR. You see, we are one of the signatories of UDHR, and so we bind ourselves to uphold those that were written there. That is why in the 1987 Philippine Constitution, we follow the principle of generally accepted principles of international law. What does that mean? We adopt as part of the law of the land those those generally accepted principles of international law. One such accepted principles of international law is that are those written in the UDHR. And then aside from that, provisions, a parallel provisions found in the Philippine Constitution would be that found in Article 3, the Bill of Rights, that guarantees that no laws, orders, or guidelines in the Philippines must be passed that go against these fundamental rights. And we have also established the Commission on Human Rights. Here, the Commission on Human Rights, they are the watchdogs. I'm sorry, it is the watchdog. They monitor, they advocate, and they educate the government. And this is independent, okay? This is independent from the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary, the three branches of the government. Why are they independent? Why there is a need for them to be independent? Because they will now be the CHR will now go against the people from the government itself. What it is fighting for is the protection of the people against the abuses that is done by the government. So, like the United Nations and the UDHR, the CHR was formed as a response to great horrors that were experienced. We are talking here of during the Marcos administration when he declared the martial law, and such atrocities were experienced. And we were so traumatized by that that after the ouster of Marcos in 1986, we changed the 1973 Constitution and created the 1987 Constitution. Under the new Constitution, we made sure that the Commission on Human Rights would be empowered. See, um, the Commission on Human Rights, with the mandate of ensuring the protection of Filipino civil and political rights, promotion of human rights education, and the facilitation of international relations with other human rights groups, was the role given to them, to the CHR. Now, it may be noticed also that the horrors during the World War II and the martial law were committed by the government or state forces. Because what the CHR mainly considers as human rights violations are actions done by governments or state forces that go against the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, as I mentioned earlier. That is why it is some people confuse it with the crime. You know, when the CHR goes against the government, they would say, okay, so this person was also killed. So why don't you go after this also? What's the main difference? Who committed that crime or that abuse? If it was done by an individual, then it is considered as a crime. But if it is committed by the state against an individual, then that is considered as a human right violation, and that's where CHR will step in. So this can include the enforcement of laws that violate freedom of speech and uniform state personnel committing extrajudicial killings. Human rights violations primarily occur when any government, recognized or otherwise, along with its associated institutions, violates the Bill of Rights. Another factor that may prompt the investigation of the CHR is if an act is intended to suppress the civil or political rights of other individuals, such as election-related violence between rival political functions. So here we have an example of what is under the jurisdiction of the CHR and what would be the jurisdiction or considered as just an ordinary crime. Okay, so I hope that you take a look at this comparison. And some cases that have been investigated by the CHR currently, There is an ongoing investigation on the EJK, on the current administration's war on drugs. And then we have the recruitment of child soldiers by the CPP-NPA, the violent dispersal of Raleigh, Mama Sapano massacre, execution of the Lumad, and the Maguindanao massacre, and forced disappearance and torture of activist Jonas Burgos, and the rape torture of activists Sherlyn Cadapan and Karen Empeño. And that is just to name a few. There are still so much more. To conclude, the discussion on which things to add or accept as which will be considered as a fundamental right is continuing and changing, but we just have to be vigilant about this. But I would also like to add, how far are we going to extend the rights, or are we becoming a self-entitled nation? Or should it really be part of our rights? So adding to this, although the UN explicitly states that being a human being is the sole requirement to afford these rights, disparities exist between different groups of people who interpret and enjoy these rights in varying degrees. As I mentioned earlier, now the rights that we consider in the third world is very different in how they would interpret that in the first world. Like in the image that we have here. Now there are so many memes out there between the third world problem and first world problem. They are funny but heartbreaking at the same time because they are true. Now for people who are saying the water tastes bad, in other nations, in other states, they might not even have water at all. So what right are we talking about here now? We have the right to food, but the kind of food that we have might be different from the kind of food that they are having as well. So ultimately, our conception of human rights change as frequently and as subtly as society does. While the world tries to make itself a better place, we are bound to run into adversities and atrocities. That is still happening. These events shape us, just as our responses to them shape what future we will live in. Because other people are imposing their own brand of rights, their own interpretation of rights. Also consider that even with all the laws, guidelines, and institutions in place, these are not absolute deterrents that would make human rights violations physically impossible. Of course not. There are people, there are nations who would think that they are beyond the reaches of the law, or that there are just some people who value their cause more than the rights of other people. And maybe, but I do not really want to think about this, but maybe there are just really bad people, no, or bad nations. Upholding and improving the state of human rights then falls under the collective responsibility of each new generation. So the good part is that even though there are bad people, I am sure that by recognizing the rights and the equality that we have with the rest of humanity, there are actually really more good people. We don't even have to go far anymore, okay? So for those of us, for those for those people who take for granted the rights that we are exercising now, just take a look at what is happening to Afghanistan. After US left Afghanistan, these people, the Afghans, knew that they will go back to the Taliban's. They will go back to the pre-American ways. Now, with under the Taliban's, why why would it scare them so much that they would rather run away? They would rather climb over that airplane, no, ride on top of that airplane, knowing the risk of death, no, if the plane would fly. In fact, there was this video that shows that there were, hopefully it's not human beings that are falling off from the sky after the plane took off. Now, but why are they running away? Because the Taliban's will now take away the rights that they have enjoyed during the stay of the Americans. The women, especially the ladies, the ladies are not recognized, their rights are not recognized. In fact, they do not want the ladies to be educated. They have started burning the schools, and they have already started taking women to wed the members of the Taliban. And so you can only imagine now the fear of these people. They would rather risk death while fleeing than sure misery under the Taliban's because of the suppression of their rights. So let us be happy now that we still enjoy the rights, but we have to be vigilant. Let us stand guard on the rights that we have won and make sure it will not be taken away again. But according to the rights-based theory, most importantly, we have to recognize and respect other people's rights. Okay, so that's it for Module 8. I hope that you uh, you you learned a lot, and also I hope that you can now think of the way to synthesize the rights-based theories with the other kinds of normative the ethical theories that we have already discussed. Stay safe, everybody.